The world needs
I don't know, yeah, we should have done it for the sanctuary, I guess. Just for those of you who are in the back, there are still some seats. We're going to be close friends right up here in the front. I know it's like anti-Lutheran, but we're going to act like we're Pentecostals or something up here this morning. I am so glad to be back and among all of you, and I just want to thank you again for your willingness to allow me to go and represent you as part of the ELCA delegation that went to Ethiopia and South Sudan. It was, well, I'm going to try over the next 40 minutes to put words to what we experienced. But I want to start out by just giving some context and some background, because this event in South Sudan and in Ethiopia did not happen overnight. This is the reason that there is a church that bears the Lutheran name in this part of East Africa is because relationships have been forming and forging and growing over many years. And it started with refugees who came here to America. I thought it was really appropriate this morning that the text, if you were in worship at 8:30, or you'll be in worship later, the biblical text today is from Jeremiah, and it's a word to these exiles who are called to plant gardens and build homes in the place to which they have been exiled. And that's what has happened among our South Sudanese here in the United States over the last 25 years, is that in the midst of a civil war, a previous civil war in South Sudan, refugees came here. And with the help of Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services and Lutheran Social Services, they found a home here. And then they found churches here. It wasn't just a matter of a social service agency making sure they had a safe place to be, but it was the hospitality of our churches, of Zumbro and Our Saviors in Austin and Our Saviors in Faribault and First Lutheran in Fargo and First Lutheran in Sioux Falls, and churches in Phoenix and in Omaha and in Atlanta. Today, the largest minority population in the ELCA are South Sudanese. It's the only minority community in our church that continues to grow and grow quickly. So we're part of something that's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing. And because of those relationships that were formed in congregations started looking to the Synod and to the church-wide offices in Chicago and saying, hey, we have this opportunity, and we're building these relationships, and now the Synod offices, the bishops are starting to pay some attention. And as we've built these relationships, we've heard about not only what's happening in South Sudanese communities here in the States, but what's happening back home, right? If you remember, Zumbro was part of helping our Dinka members and members in southeastern Minnesota get on buses and go to Omaha, Nebraska to vote for their independence in 2010, November 2010. And we raised about $5,500, I think, in about 24 hours. And we were able to send 300 people on buses so that they could vote through a snowstorm, nonetheless. But they were able to vote for their independence. And that was a huge sign of our commitment and our care for our South Sudanese brothers and sisters. So these relationships have been forming and strengthening over a long time. And one of the things that I take away from my time in South Sudan is just a deep gratitude for how our church has actually come together, congregations and individuals and bishops' offices and the church-wide office in Chicago, to do something that none of us would have been able to do on our own. It is a great visible sign of how, when we take our $90,000 from our budget and we send it to the Synod office and put it to use for ministry in the wider church, how it's making an impact, exponential impact on the lives of people. And I'm going to spend some time today telling you some of those stories of lives that I've seen changed over the last couple weeks. Here's a quick timeline. I say peace is a process, Refugees came in the 1990s during Civil War with the North, assisted by LSS and LRS. In the early 2000s, it was about then that South Sudanese started worshiping in our communities, like I mentioned. And in 2010, conversations began about the nature of these relationships with South Sudanese communities and host congregations. Most of these South Sudanese congregations that started in Lutheran churches just started using space, just like the Dinka here. They came to the leadership and said, hey, we want to have a church, will you give us space? And a lot of churches said, sure, yeah, you can have space. Most of those churches gave it to them for free. But then we started talking about what does it mean for us to be in relationship, and that was about 7 years ago. And then in 2011, the South Sudanese were granted independence from Sudan. For us, in 2013, Zumbro and the Dinka mutually agreed to become one congregation in 2 languages. Both communities voted to say, we are brothers and sisters, we're one church. And they still have a whole lot of pride about that. They remind me just about every time I'm with them, we are one church. And that same year, civil war broke out between tribes in South Sudan, displacing 1.6 million people, and it grows. It grows exponentially. And so now that war was done with the North and the South, now there is fighting between tribes, predominantly between Dinka and Nuer, which are the 2 largest tribes in South Sudan. In the midst of civil war, in 2014, the ELCA makes South Sudan a key component of a 5-year fundraising campaign, responding to the work of congregations with South Sudanese ministries. Talk about an act of faith, right? That our church, the ELCA, says, there's a civil war going on, but there are people here in our communities and there are people back in South Sudan who feel called to be church together, and we're going to help make that happen. A bold act of faith. And in 2015, 2 South Sudanese ELCA pastors who were trained here in the United States, Walreet, or we say Walreet, he laughs, he goes, my name's Walreet. But that just takes a lot of energy. And Mawin Arik were appointed missionaries to South Sudan and Ethiopia. Mawin was here about 1.5 years ago. He was our interim South Sudanese pastor here before Common became the lay evangelist at Zumbro. So we have ties to both of them. And in 2015, a groundbreaking in Juba for Reconciliation Lutheran Church Community Center and Clinic took place. So where are we talking? Some of you probably hope you know where South Sudan is, but if you don't, so Tanzania is right here. Our other partner is about right there. It's about where Nyambi Hospital is. And so I spent time with both Wal and Mawin. Wal is along the border in Ethiopia in the Gambela district. This is a place in Ethiopia that is deeply South Sudanese. In fact, the governor of the state is a Nuer, South Sudanese man. Because there have been refugees there from Sudan and South Sudan for so long that most of the town is South Sudanese. The culture is very South Sudanese. It looks very different than Addis Ababa, the capital. And so I spent about 4 days or 3 days with Wal in the communities there, and then we flew back to Addis and then flew to Juba for the dedication. Let me tell you a little bit about Wal. Wal came here eventually to Faribault, Minnesota as a refugee in 1992. And he showed up at Our Savior's Lutheran Church there in Faribault and started worshiping, sitting in the back. Some other Nuer started kind of hanging around, and pretty soon they said, I wonder if we could have a Nuer-speaking church here. And a church was formed. That community, it's kind of fluxed up and down as employment has been available in Faribault, and at this point there are no more Nuer really left in Faribault. But in 2006, Walt went home to South Sudan, and in about 6 months, just started 5 churches. How many pastors in the room? Any of us started 5 churches in 6 months? Yeah. What's that?
Never started one.
No, me neither. And he got this network of churches up and running. He appointed lay leaders to run those churches. When he returned to the United States, he continued to come back and work here. He went to seminary, got his team certificate, which is theological education for emerging ministries, because he doesn't have a bachelor's degree. But our church has a way to raise up leaders in a variety of communities, and so he was ordained in the ELCA in 2015 and appointed to be a missionary to his people in the refugee camps and along the border in the Gambela region in Ethiopia. When he came back to Gambela in 2015, there were 9 churches. And in the last 2.5 years, there are now 26 churches. And we spend time. When I left here, I thought, I'm going to go and meet these leaders of these churches, and we're going to spend some time with them, and we will learn from them and hear what's going on, what church looks like. Well, we landed in Gambela at about 9:30 that morning on a Friday, and Walt got us to our hotel. We dropped off our bags. He goes, "You have to hurry because people are waiting for you." And we said, "Oh, how many people?" He said, "Oh, about 500." Yeah, these weren't all leaders. 500 people had taken buses out of the refugee camps across the border to greet us and to welcome us. And I want to show you the video real quick. Just blank this out. So we came off the road and walked down this dirt path to the church. The church is there in the background with the tin roof on it, and this is what we experienced here. Great videography, isn't it? I know my phone broke. So I don't know if you heard at the end, but Walt said, "Sit down, they're going to wash your feet." So all the leaders lined up down the path. The kids had already greeted us on the street and followed us down the path. And we greet one another with Male, 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 Male Magua, Male, Male, Male Magua. Welcome very much. And we sat down, and the women took off our shoes and washed our feet. It was like standing on holy ground, to be served by those who come from such dire situations, but who were so grateful for a visit. I better go back to my PowerPoint here. So they welcomed us with open arms. You see here, I have a little pointer. Let's see. Oh, I do. So the deacons are in robes and head coverings. They are the servants of the church. Everyone, just about everyone in the Newer churches have a role. And so the deacons, they do the caring. They form the community. They do the day-to-day ministry. They go out and visit the sick. And they sing. So they sang for us. So the choir sang. And then all of these here on the ground are all the youth choirs as well. So 500 people greeted us that first day, and we were a bit overwhelmed. We had no idea what to expect. If you think about what kind of life many of these folks are living right now, in the refugee camps, most people, but not everyone, has a ration card. And a ration card is like a golden ticket, right? Or maybe like a tin ticket. It will get you some food each day. It gives you access to basic medical care, and allows you to live within the camp. It gives your kids access to some education. But not everyone in the camps have ration cards. I met one young man. He was in this choir here. And he was walking around. He was kind of one of the leaders, probably about 20 years old, and he was hobbling as he was directing the choir. And Wall leaned over to me and said, he wants to talk to you afterward. 3 years ago, in the midst of the war, his family was fleeing. He got caught up in fighting and was shot in the abdomen. And must have hit a nerve of some sort and had extreme pain down his leg and through his heel. And it was preventing him from marrying. It was preventing him from just being productive in any way. And because he was caught up in the fighting, and his family got to the refugee camp before he did, they got ration cards, but he didn't have one. So he didn't have access to medical care. And so he came and visited me, and we talked a little bit, and we were able to provide him. Medical care is pretty basic and not very expensive in South Sudan, so we were able to provide him a little bit of money so that he could get to the hospital, and one of his pastor then brought him to the hospital. I will say that the hospital in Gambela was not a place that I'd want to be treated. We were given a tour of the hospital, and the care was basic at best, but it was more than what he had access to where he was. One of the great things. So we came back on Sunday then, and worshipped with them. We left our hotel about 8 o'clock, and we arrived about 8:20, and they were already singing, and there was already about 700 or 800 people there, and we worshipped for 7 hours. No break. Fortunately, it was overcast, and it was only 88 degrees. It was actually quite lovely. There was enough of a breeze, but we worshipped outside. But one of the things that they had us do while we were there was to commission their deacons and their elders, and to install new lay pastors. 5 new lay pastors. So in these 26 churches, they actually have structure, right? And so they have 12 lay pastors in 3 parishes. So the pastor serves a parish, and then some of the lay evangelists will serve the individual churches, and then Wall kind of oversees the whole thing. And so these are the preachers. They are literate. They can read and aware, which is not an easy thing to do because the written language is only about 60 years old. It hasn't been around very long, and so even though they may speak it fluently, they'll read Arabic and English, but they can't read Nuer because it's just not taught anywhere. It's not part of their schooling. They commissioned, or we installed 5 lay pastors, 2 women. It was really exciting to be present to be installing the first female pastors in this group. A lot of other female leadership, but these were the first female pastors in this group of congregations. I want to tell you a little bit about Elizabeth. So one afternoon we met with all the leaders around a table, and they told us the long list of the things that they needed, the desires for their churches, what they're doing, what's happening in the refugee camps. And Elizabeth was the only woman sitting at this table of 24 men. And when she took her place at that table, I knew that she needed to be listened to because she had something important to say. And we went around, and as we were talking, she's one of the 2 commissioned pastors. As they're giving their laundry list of needs and the things that they don't have, Elizabeth chimes in and she says, "Here's what I want. I want to empower our women, and I want to provide a way for them to make money so that they can provide for their children and get their kids to school. What we want is, we want a grinding mill. If we have a grinding mill, then the whole community will come, and we can charge them a little bit of money to grind their mill, and we'll form community for the women." She's laying this whole thing out. She's got an economic plan for her ministry. Didn't hear any other economic plans. I'm not quite sure why that is, but she had this clear vision of what would actually sustain her community and move them forward. And so when we met with the church-wide leadership in global mission, we were able to share that vision and talk a little bit about what that might take. I don't know, we made no promises. That's the thing in Africa. You make no promises. We listen a lot, and we'll continue to be in those conversations. But she was quite amazing. It's a photo of all the deacons with their head wrap. They love these head coverings with screen printed images of Jesus and Mary on the back of them. And so they can't get enough of those. But it's really very, very cool. And then there was the choir. So we installed pastors and deacons, and we sang, and we heard a sermon, and then at the end, toward the end, about 4.5, 5 hours in, the choir started to sing. And it wasn't just like a nice anthem. It was like a sing-off. And they were like throwing down. And every choir from each of the churches that had come showed up and started singing. And they would go back and forth. I have one little snippet of one choir that I want to share with you. Those guys might need a little bit more breath support. But but it was joy. It's just sheer joy to hear them sing. One of the things that I learned about the choirs is that you can join the choir when you are of marrying age. Yeah. So, all the single ladies, right? Yeah, I don't know if it serves as a matchmaking scheme or what. But these young people came and just sang their hearts out. And as each choir started singing, pretty soon in the background, way off in the distance, we heard another choir coming toward us. And we weren't quite sure what was going on. And they marched through the camp and sat up on this hill, kind of a mound in the back of the worshiping area, all dressed in the same similar kind of smock. And we found out that it was the Missouri Synod choir came to visit with us. You know, one of the things that we've done is we've exported all of our divisions. but it was amazing because they came and then, you know, they were given space to sing and there was just fellowship, you know. Later that afternoon, Wall took us, he wanted to show us some of these other churches because as you can see, the church here is awfully rudimentary, right? They'll have to rebuild it about every 4 to 7 years, depending on how much rain, because it's just sticks and mud, and it'll eventually wash away. And so he wanted to show us some of the churches that were a little bit more advanced, you know. And the Missouri Synod Church happened to be just around the corner. Well, that afternoon we were all in clerical collars and walked into their courtyard, and there was about 25 people there, and they saw us, and they started singing. They welcomed us with open arms and got chairs out and had us sit down, and were ready to serve tea. And I thought, man, maybe we could learn something from one another, from our African brothers and sisters. But the sounds of joy were incredibly evident just about everywhere we went. And one of the things I noticed too with the Nuer is everything's communal. If you notice in the video, they hold hands and sway back and forth. The whole congregation, when they sing a congregational song, everyone sways. There's someone up front going like this and directing and getting everyone to move in one motion. It's this beautiful kind of visible sign of unity. This trip was really about people and a place. So after we spent a few days with the Nuer, and we spent some time with the Aniwak too, but for time I kind of cut that out. You can ask more questions later. But so we left Gambela on Monday morning and flew back to Addis Ababa, stayed the night there, and caught an early morning flight on Tuesday to Juba. And Juba, I was not sure what to expect. One of the things that struck me immediately in the air was the stark difference in landscape between Ethiopia and South Sudan. So as you fly over Ethiopia, there are roads everywhere. There are like villages, little kind of blobs of communities with tentacles that run down the roads. It looks orderly, it looks developed. And as you move out into the countryside, there are beautifully marked fields. It's green and lush and fertile. And you can tell that there's an economy driving that country. Just about as soon as we crossed over the border, flying overhead, it is as blank as you could imagine. It looks like the only thing that has touched the land is the hand of God in creation. There are no roads, there are no villages, there is no agriculture, there's nothing. And we probably flew for a half an hour before I saw anything. And what I saw was a dirt landing strip with a World Food Program airplane at the end of it, and a perfect circle of like an NGO compound. That was it until we got closer to Juba. And Juba is by all estimates, is a city of about 230,000. There's probably about 400,000 people there now. Gambela, by contrast, is about 250 to 300,000 people. Gambela was more developed than Juba in a lot of ways, and which is surprising given that Juba is the national capital of South Sudan. Right? The government district was developed, but the roads were few and far between. And so, as we were flying into Juba, out the side of the plane, Pete Royce, my companion and the assistant of the bishop, looked out, and he saw this bell tower sticking out like a beacon, shining in the sun. It's the biggest building in the whole area. And this is Reconciliation Lutheran Church Community Center and Clinic. When we arrived, there was a lot of work to do yet. It was Tuesday afternoon, and the dedication with the president of South Sudan was scheduled for 10:30 on Thursday morning. And they were still painting floors, and they were painting steps, and they were painting trim. And I think they probably painted that, and then we walked through it, so they probably painted again. If you notice all the footprints. This is a sanctuary. It seats, well, in Western standards, it seats about 450 people. I heard from one of our ELCA staff members who I was with that on Sunday morning, their first worship service, 1,500 people showed up. So they're hanging from the rafters and probably poking their head through the windows, and they are at the center of a whole lot of hope, a whole lot of hope. So we got there. There was boxes everywhere that needed to be unpacked. So lest you think I just sat and worshipped for 11 days, I did put a little blood, sweat, and tears into some work. These are chairs that got into the sanctuary. The acoustics in that sanctuary were amazing. Yeah, Zumbro, you would appreciate the acoustics. I stood on the balcony and I just couldn't help but sing, just to hear how the sounds bounced around. And I started singing that, Hallelujah, Hallelujah. And Wall, who was behind me, I'd never heard him sing before, but he then started singing behind me. And then we had this cadence, so it was beautiful. This is the courtyard behind the church, and the two stories that you see on either side is the community center and education center. And they already had computers for a computer lab to learn some basic computer skills. They had sewing machines that showed up, and by Monday morning, just this Monday morning, women showed up and started sewing together. They were ready. So they got those out of the boxes and set up and started teaching one another that first day after worship. This is, in the midst of this community, is very small tin shacks, lots of tarps, not a whole lot of development. Maybe a block back there are nicer homes around, but you could tell just every time we were around, there is just this sense of this is going to be our place. The local general who runs the police force in that part of Juba has given the pastor Moeen and Benyam from Chicago his direct line and said, if you need security at any time, let us know. He sends two armed police officers every night, and they just stay outside the building because they recognize it's for the community, and they don't want anything to happen to it. And so after the dedication, we got rid of all the boxes, and this was packed with people. Kids were running up and around the top balcony, just their eyes as wide as saucers and smiles on their faces, and you just couldn't help but be caught up in their joy and the hope that they have for a safe place for them and their families. And behind this is the clinic. And the clinic here is meant to be primary care, particularly antenatal, so newborns and women and children. And when we walked through on Tuesday, there were already like 36 women just sitting there in community in this courtyard, talking and wanting to help get things set up and trying to figure out how they could be part of all of this. Dr. Jacob is going to be the director. He's working with Mark Jacobson, who is a doctor at Arusha Lutheran Medical Center in Tanzania. And one of the great things about being able to be at Juba was to see all of the partnerships that we have through IAMBI, making inroads in South Sudan also. Mark and Linda Jacobson were both there, and they're going to consult on a long-term basis to help get the clinic established, get the staff up and running, help them figure out how to organize a clinic. Global Health Ministries had sent a container of medical supplies, or who we have used a number of times at IAMBI, and they sent a volunteer to help, who's a nurse practitioner, to help establish that. We spent a whole afternoon sorting bandages and IVs and all kinds of catheters and more bars of soap. I think it counted 68,000 bars of soap. So, you know, this has all been about relationships. All started with partnerships in congregations like ours. There's us doing some sorting. Dr. Mark Jacobson there in the center, and Dr. Jacob Mayen on the left. He works full-time at the hospital, the teaching hospital in Juba, but will be on staff. And this will be the first permanent fistula clinic in South Sudan. So they will be serving women who desperately need this procedure and a livelihood after that. And so there's a lot of excitement about that. They have 2 midwives and 2 nurses already hired, and an administrator who is super sharp. Angelina was great, and she was directing all of us to get work done over here and over there. And this was at the dedication on Thursday of blessing the clinic and praying for the work that's going to be done there. All of the nurses on the left and ELCA staff and others around. So I want to kind of close with this story, and then I'll leave a few minutes for questions. So this is cool. He's the engineer who built this building. And I was talking with him and his friend Eric. That's not Eric. That's Andrew. Cool and Eric were asking me, "Do you have tribes in America?" Because we were talking about Nuer and Dinka. They happen to be Dinka, and I was talking about how I work with Dinka members here in Zamro, and I said, "Well, yes, but not like you have here in Africa. I would say that, my tribe is probably Lutheran, if anything." And he goes, "Oh, I'm Lutheran. Does that mean that we're part of the same tribe?" And I said, "Yeah, it does." And Wal was standing there, who's Nuer, and I said, "Wal, he's Lutheran too, and he's part of our tribe also." And Andrew jumped in. He goes, "I'm Lutheran." And then Patricia, who works for the LCA, she's from Tanzania. She said, "I'm Lutheran too." And so all of a sudden, we had this whole variety of people claiming a new tribe. And I think that is what is hoped for by building this building. This building costs $1.5 million, and they are just shy of $1 million raised. And so they have some work to do yet, but it is aptly named, and what is happening there already, in spite of them not really being ready for it to be open, is reconciliation. Things are happening where people are coming together and finding some common life together. So yes, we have tribes in America. I said just don't get in fights with other church tribes, okay? Because we do that in America, and it's not very helpful. This photo was taken at the dedication of the sanctuary. In the center is Rafael Malpica Padilla. He's the executive director for global mission in the ELCA. He was bishop in Puerto Rico and head of the global mission for Latin America before he was executive director. And in the dedication service of a sanctuary, you go to the pulpit and you go to the baptismal font and you go to the altar. And when we got to the point where he was dedicating the altar, and the altar came actually from St. Luke's Lutheran Church in Goodhue, Minnesota, and so did the pulpit, and the baptismal font came from First Lutheran in Blooming Prairie. And so there's part of our synod right there in that church. But Raphael said, now typically we just kind of do this thing and we're gonna bless the altar, but I want all of the young people to come forward. And I want all the rest of you all to come forward. And they surrounded the altar. You see Martha Beck, who's the Zumbro member, there in pink. And the man next to her is the Episcopal assistant of the bishop in South Sudan, and Wal Reed, and some others. But he had everyone surround the altar. And he said to them, now we must remember that this is the Lord's table. And God invites all of us to it. And it's by God's grace that we have access to it. And it's our responsibility to ensure that everyone comes and gathers here and receives God's love and God's mercy. And there in that place, he basically said, we are to embody this message of reconciliation. This community can't just be named this. We have to be this. And it was beautiful. And all the young people came and they laid their hands on the table, and we prayed this powerful prayer, and then went in peace. I have no idea what's going to happen. I don't have any idea what's going to happen in the next year or 2 or 5 years in South Sudan. I don't know how successful this ministry is going to be. I really don't. But I do know that God has been at work for a long time making this happen. Bringing relationships together in ways that have actually made something this big happen. It's not just the building. Think about the ministry that will happen in it. I think about the ministry that's happening in Gambela with Wal and all these leaders, and how peace and reconciliation and hope are blooming in the midst of really unthinkable circumstances. I think about Jeremiah. Plant homes and gardens, and have children, and work for the welfare of the city. It was exiles who came to America and showed us their life and introduced us to their faith, and who called us to walk alongside them and to go home with them. And now I feel like we are working side by side to do what Jeremiah instructs those exiles to do. To work for the good of the city, and to trust always that God is there, planting a future filled with hope. That's the band from the president. That's the president's band at the dedication. I'll be honest, I'm not sure how comfortable I felt with the president. There's a lot of tension about the president and his leadership, but certainly the publicity was good. We made the national news that night, and they had the band playing on. I wouldn't have wanted to wear those outfits though. It was about 101 degrees that day, so it was time to go. You may have seen this picture from Pastor Lisa's sermon last Sunday, but this was just a thank you to you, and just a sign of the hope that the future has in South Sudan too. That there's all these young people who are doing amazing things, and they were so excited to gather around and hold on to that banner. So, a couple minutes for questions. Yeah, Al.
What would be the cost of
The meal? Oh, the mill. The grinding mill. The grinding mill. I think I asked Walt about $10,000. So it's a substantial piece of equipment that would need some infrastructure behind it too. About $10,000. Yeah.
How about the acceptance of the 2 lay female pastors? Do people welcome them as their pastor, or is there conflict about having a woman pastor there?
No, actually, the leadership is raised up from the community, and so I mean these were 2 women who were raised up from their churches to be their pastors. So there is an openness, and certainly it's still a very patriarchal society, and men kind of dominate, but a lot of that is changing. Just ask Martha Beck. She, when I'm with her, she shows us how the roles of women and men are definitely changing. Yeah.
You mentioned how the Nuer and the Dinka fight each other. Now, we house the Dinka here, but we talked about working with the Nuer. Are you getting any sense of the interactions between the tribes when you were there?
Within the church, I think this is one of the things that sets the church apart right now, is that the church is... Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, did I get any sense of the tension between the Dinka and the Nuer when I was there, if those are the 2 tribes that are fighting? And the church is really serving as a catalyst for change, really trying very hard. You might have seen in one of my blog posts, one day Wal and Maween is Dinka and Wal is Nuer, and so we've intentionally called 2 different tribes to serve in this mission. But Maween grabbed Wal's hand and took him across the street from the community center into the shop, and introduced him to a woman who came from Wal's village. Said, "I want you to meet," I didn't catch her name, and of course he knew her, and I think he did that because he wanted Wal to feel safe in Juba. Wal had never been to Juba ever before. He's South Sudanese, but he lives way, much closer to Ethiopia than he does to Juba, and so he had never been before, and was terrified actually to go because there's many more Dinka in power in Juba, and a lot of Nuer are actually in internally displaced camps in Juba. So they're refugee camps within the country. Yeah, George. They can't understand each other, that's for sure. Yeah. No, it's quite different. Yeah. 1 or 2 more questions, and I'm going to be late for worship. But yeah.
Pastor, how did you communicate? Do you know a little bit of each of those languages, or do you have translators, or do you guys speak English?
I actually, a lot of them spoke a little English. We would struggle sometimes. Wal translated for us often in smaller settings, and I knew enough pleasantries, probably to be dangerous, but but picked up a little bit of Nuer, a little bit of Aniwak, a little bit of Dinka. So yeah, but not tons. I'm not like Pastor Lisa, who's learning Swahili. So yeah. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.